Let's open in our Bibles to James chapter 1, and we're going to continue in part 2 of the series of studies that we began last week. If you were not here last week, we started a series of lessons on the issues that divided us. And if you were not here, and if you're not sure what I'm talking about when I use that expression, the issues that divided us, in the 1950s and the 1960s, there was a great division among the churches of Christ. It was a very ugly and bitter division. There was ugliness and hostility on both sides of the division. Christians were not acting like Christians. And we talked a little bit about the history of some of the things that led up to this division. We started in the 1920s, and we went through the 1960s. If you missed that lesson, I would encourage you to go to our website, go to our YouTube channel, and listen to that lesson. It sets a historical foundation for where we want to go in this series. And as I'm saying that, I'm not sure that the lesson is up on the website just yet, so I'm putting a little pressure on the tech guys to do that. But our guys are usually really good about getting things up in a timely way, so if you missed that lesson, it will be there soon. But what was this division all about? Well, you remember last week I said that there's really one primary question, one foundational question that the division was based upon. And that question was, what is the proper relationship between local churches of Christ and various human institutions? Now, there were specific institutions that were the major topics of discussion. The orphans' homes was a major issue. Colleges and schools that are associated today, especially with churches of Christ. What is the relationship between churches and those institutions? Should churches be supporting those institutions from their collective treasuries? That was a major question. In fact, that was basically the question that was being debated. Now, those who said, yes, churches ought to be supporting those institutions from their treasuries, those came to be known as institutional churches. And there were some who said, no, we don't think churches ought to be doing that. And so those came to be known as non-institutional churches. So if you've heard those expressions before, well, that's an institutional church of Christ, or that's a non-institutional church, now you understand what those terms are all about. And so this morning, what we're going to start to do is to dig into some of the specific issues that were being debated. And this morning, we're going to talk about the orphans' home. At the end of our lesson, we're going to quickly throw in the colleges, but we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on the colleges, and I'll explain why that is when we get there. But the primary focus of our lesson this morning is about the orphans' homes and the controversy that was associated with that. So as we think about this issue, the issue of the orphans' home, and should a church be supporting it from its treasury or not, I want us to understand what the issue really was, okay? But first, in order to answer what the issue was, I want to answer that in the negative by saying what the issue was not. I think sometimes we have misconceptions about what the problems of that day were, and I want to address 3 misconceptions that sometimes we have about what the issue was. First of all, the issue was not whether orphans ought to be cared for. Okay, that was not the issue. James 1 verse 27 takes care of that for us, where James says that pure and undefiled religion before God is to visit or care for orphans and widows in their distress. If we want to have pure, undefiled religion before God, James says we need to be concerned about people in need. We need to be concerned about orphans and widows. Now, those are not the only 2 things that are required to have pure and undefiled religion, but James just says, here's some things that you need to be mindful of. So this was not the issue. The issue was not, secondly, about who cared more about orphans, institutional people or non-institutional people. One of the things that was seen during this division was the ugliness that was displayed, again, from both sides. But among the institutional people, there was a lot of misrepresentation about the non-institutional people. And so you would hear expressions like, well, the non-institutional people, they are anti-orphan. They hate orphans. They're orphan haters. And if you left a little poor orphan baby crying on the steps of the church house, they'd just leave it there crying and wouldn't do anything to help that baby. That was not true at all. That was a misrepresentation of the non-institutional position. Or they would say, well, they'll take care of their preacher. They'll pay the preacher and make sure the preacher's family's taken care of, but they don't care anything about those poor little orphans. That was a misrepresentation of the worst kind. History has shown that the non-institutional people cared just as much about orphans as the institutional people did. And I can provide you with specific statistics that would prove that. Adoption, foster care, and other means were used by non-institutional people to fulfill the command of James 1:27, to care for orphans in their distress. Now here's a third thing that the issue was not, and this one may surprise you. The issue originally was not even whether the church had a responsibility to care for orphans in the first place. That would become an issue later. But when all of this first started in the late 1930s and in the 40s, even this was not the issue. Everybody just assumed, and that's the right word, they assumed that churches ought to be contributing to orphan homes from their treasuries. So these things were not the issue. Well, what was the issue? Well, let me put a chart up on the board that I think may help us understand what the issue was. Over here on the right side of the screen, you've got the work that needs to be done. You've got orphans who need to be cared for. They need shelter. They need clothing. They need groceries. They need medicine. There's all of these needs. This is the work that needs to be done. Well, over here on the left side of the screen then, you've got these various circles that represent individual local churches of Christ, the churches, as they assumed, who were supposed to carry out the work that needed to be done. So you've got the churches to do the work, you've got the needed work, you've got the orphans who need to be cared for, but in between you had this institutional board of directors who said to the churches, you send us your money and we will oversee the work that needs to be done. The issue was about this institutional board. The non-institutional people, as they came to be known, they looked at this arrangement and they said, wait a minute. We've got an institutional board that is standing between the churches and the work that needs to be done. And so the question that they asked was, should an institutional board provide oversight for the work of churches of Christ? The issue was about organization. Where do we read about in the pages of our New Testament an institutional board, a separate institution from the church that oversees the work of a church? Do you understand? Now, this institutional board, it would be made up of Christians from many different congregations. So you'd have one or two Christians from Greenville, you'd have two or three from Charlotte, two or three from Columbia, maybe one or two from Charleston, and these Christians would come together and form this institutional board, this board of directors. So the churches would send their money to the board of directors, and then the board of directors would oversee the work, providing shelter, clothing, medicine, etc. This is what the issue was all about. Should an institutional board, a separate organization from a local church, oversee the work of a local church? That was the issue. Now, I want to emphasize that, okay? So if I come to you at the end of the lesson and I say, what was the primary issue? This is what I want you to say. There's an institutional board overseeing the work of multiple churches of Christ. So what's the issue with this arrangement? What's the problem with this arrangement? Well, the non-institutional people said, we don't see that in our Bibles. We don't see New Testament authority for that kind of arrangement. Let me just show you a couple of passages that I think are important. Matthew chapter 21, verses 23 and 25. When Jesus entered the temple, the chief priests and the elders of the people came to him while he was teaching, and they said, "By what authority are you doing these things? And who gave you this authority?" That's a fair question. Jesus, you came into our temple yesterday, and you drove everybody out, and you caused this great upheaval, and you're teaching things that we don't like. What authority do you have to do this? And who gave it to you? That's a fair question. So Jesus said, knowing their motives, I'm going to ask you a question. The baptism of John, did it come from heaven or did it come from men? And you answer my question, and then I'll answer your question. Now, the Jews didn't want to answer his question. He backed them into a corner. If they said, well, John's baptism came from heaven, then he would say, well, then why didn't you listen to him? But if we say, well, John just did this of his own will, it came from man, John just started teaching it himself, then the people are going to get upset because they believe John was a prophet who came from God. So they said, well, we don't know. But I want you to notice what Jesus says. Did it come from heaven or did it come from men? And when it comes to everything that we believe and practice in our faith, we need to ask this question. Did it come from heaven? Did it come from God? Do we read about it on the pages of our Bibles? Or did it come from men? Did it come from our own thinking and our own wisdom? Is this one of our traditions that we think is a good idea, and now we're going to proceed upon this thinking that came from men? Let me remind you of a second passage. 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 16 and 17, that says, all Scripture is given by the inspiration of God and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness, that the man of God may be complete, thoroughly equipped for every good work. I want us to make sure we see that last expression. What is it that equips us for every good work? The Scriptures equip us for every good work. So if something is a good work that we should do in God's service, we're going to read about it in the Scriptures. If it's not in the Scriptures, it's not a good work, no matter how great it seems to be in our minds. Are you with me? All right. This was the issue. Where do we find New Testament authority for an institutional board providing oversight for the work of multiple churches of Christ? Good works come from the Scriptures. If we don't see it in the Scriptures, then it's not a good work. Is an arrangement involving an institutional board standing between churches of Christ and the work to be done, is that something we read about in the New Testament? If it is, then let's do it. And let's do it with full faith and conviction. But if it's not, then let's come up with another way to carry out the commands that God has given. Now, I've often heard it said about institutional people who went for this arrangement with the institutional board. Well, they just didn't care that they didn't see an institutional board in the New Testament. They didn't care about Bible authority. They just wanted to go do their own thing, and they didn't care what the New Testament said. That's not true at all. You can go back to the 50s and 60s and read the articles and listen to the debates. These men, on both sides of the issue, they believed in finding New Testament authority. They believed that you had to have book, chapter, and verse for everything that we practice and everything that we teach. So let's not make a false accusation against them by saying, well, they just don't care about authority, because that's not true. Everyone in this discussion wanted authority, and they believed that they had it. Now, I think the institutional people made some faulty applications of those scriptures that they used. But men on both sides of the issues sought authority for their practices. Well, what were the arguments that they used? They wanted authority. What were the arguments that they presented to provide that authority? Well, the first argument was quite simple. The institutional board and that arrangement is just an expedient way of carrying out God's command. So we have the required commandment, James 1:27. We need to care for orphans and widows in their distress. That's the commandment. We need to do that. God tells us what to do, but He didn't tell us how to do it. He didn't give us the specifics on how to do it. So we have a general command, care for orphans and widows, but we don't have any specifics. And so the specifics are up to us. Whatever methods we want to use, that is fine if it's an expedient method. It's kind of like Mark 16 and verse 15, where Jesus said, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature." He didn't tell them how to go. They could walk, they could ride a camel, they could ride a horse, they could take a boat. In our world today, we could drive a car, we could take an airplane, whatever we want to use. He didn't tell us how to go. He didn't give us the specifics. He just said go. Whatever method of going is expedient to us, then that's what we can do. But the people who opposed, they said, no, this is a little bit different. Because we're not objecting to the methods that we use. We're objecting to the organization that's being used. A church can use whatever methods it finds to be expedient. Let's just say, for instance, that the Taylor's church had 5 women in it who were widows. And these women don't have any family who can provide for their needs. And they are not capable themselves of functioning with a high level of independence. They can't drive. Maybe they're older and they can't see very well. They're not capable of living alone. So we've got these 5 widows. How can we care for them? What methods can we use to care for them? Well, we can use whatever methods are expedient. We could even go purchase a house for them and let them all live there together. And we could check in on them on a regular basis and pay their utility bills and buy their groceries and those things that they need. That's a method that we could use and be completely within the realm of Scripture to do that. But the objection was to organization. What we're not going to do is to send our money to a separate organization and let that organization oversee the work that we need to do for our widows. Do you see the point? This is not about methods. It was about organization. Should we create a separate institution to do the work of this local church? And the non-institutional people said no. Now here was the second argument. This one is a little bit more sophisticated. You're going to have to stay with me on this, all right? Anybody speak Latin here? All right. The second argument was called the in loco parentis argument. Now let me translate. Loco, place, location. Parentis, that's quite obvious, parents. In place of the parents. Okay? So the in loco parentis argument went like this. Here you have an original home. A nuclear family, mom, dad, let's say 2 kids. You got a family of 4, the original home. If that church, or if that home rather, fell into some kind of serious financial need, could a local church help that original home? Well, everybody would say, well, yeah, of course they could do that. All right? Well, let's say one day that the parents are out driving their car and they get in a car accident and the parents are both killed and those 2 children are left behind as orphaned children. Those children are then taken and put into an orphan's home, overseen by this institutional board of directors, and what you have in that orphan's home is simply a restoration of the original home. The parents have been killed, the family's been divided, but now the orphan's home is going to become substitute parents, as it were, and restore the home, providing for those children the same things that their parents would have provided: food, shelter, clothing, guidance, etc. So if the church can help the original home, then why can't the church help the restored home? Kind of a slick argument, huh? Now, there were several objections that were made to this argument, but I'm just going to give you the main one. And really, this is the one that really struck this argument down and made it non-sustainable. Let's suppose that this original home that's under consideration was a Roman Catholic family. Now, you could use whatever religious group you want. I'm not picking on Roman Catholicism, but let's just say it was a Roman Catholic family. The parents are killed in that car accident. Can a local church support that Catholic family? Now, regardless of what your answer might be, their answer back then would have been yes. Okay? So those Catholic children are then taken and placed into a Catholic orphans home. Then does that mean that local churches of Christ should be financially supporting Catholic orphanages? Well, even the institutional people said, we don't want to go that far. But you see, that's the logical outcome of the argument. And so that argument didn't work. And these were the two main arguments that were primarily used, but as we see, neither one really provides scriptural support for the institutional arrangement. Well, while these issues were being debated, articles, debates going back and forth about expediency and general and specific authority and Latin expressions that we had to go to great lengths to explain, while all of this is going on, somebody said, now wait a minute. We need to ask another question. And the issue shifted from the institutional board arrangement to something else. And when the issue shifted, the original issue about the institutional board serving as overseers of the work of churches of Christ, that went to the back seat. And this next issue came to the forefront. The issue that came up and took primary place in the discussion was this question. Should local churches of Christ be supporting orphan homes with orphans in them from all backgrounds, whether they're Christian or not? Should local churches be supporting those things anyways, regardless of what the arrangement is? Whether there's an institutional board or not, should local churches do that? And what came to be the primary issue was what is called limited benevolence. That is, church benevolence is limited to Christians, not non-Christians, and given to all men generally. This is really what came to be a major issue, but it was a secondary issue. It was not the original issue. But when we read in the New Testament about churches giving benevolent help to needy people, there's something that we see. We see that every occasion where a church financially supported people in need, the money that they gave went to Christians. We never see an example of a church giving money to non-Christians. And somebody noticed this back in the 1950s and 60s when they were studying their Bible. They said, wait a minute, should we even be giving money to orphans' homes in the first place? Those are not exclusively Christians in those orphan homes. Those orphan homes serve all kinds of orphans, whether they're Christians or not. So do we need to be giving financially from church treasuries to all men generally? Now, let's make sure we understand the issue. This is about churches collectively from their treasury. This is not about individuals. If an individual Christian wants to take of his own funds and give money to an orphan's home, there would never be an issue with that. Nobody would ever say you shouldn't do that. This is not about individuals. You can do whatever you want to do with your money. As long as, number one, you're showing principles of good stewardship, and number two, you're not spending your money on something sinful. But outside of those realms, you can do whatever you want to do with your money. This was a discussion about church treasury. Okay? So let's look at some passages. Go with me to Acts chapter 2. And what I want to do real quickly is just show you every passage where we see a local church financially supporting people in need. Every passage in the New Testament. Let's look at some of these. Acts chapter 2, look with me at verse 44. And I want you to read and notice who is being financially supported in each one of these passages. Acts chapter 2, verse 44. And all those who had believed were together and had all things in common. And they began selling their property and possessions and were sharing them with all as anyone might have need. All who believed were doing this. All right, go to Acts chapter 4. Look at verse 32. And the congregation of those who believed were of one heart and soul, and not one of them claimed that anything belonging to him was his own, but all things were common property to them. Them who? The congregation of believers. Verse 34, for there was not a needy person among them, for all who were owners of land or houses would sell them and bring the proceeds of the sales and lay them at the apostles' feet, and they would be distributed to any as each had need. Who? Well, verse 32 says the congregation of believers. Look at Acts chapter 6. Go to verse 1. This is still the church at Jerusalem. And it says that at this time, verse 1, while the disciples were increasing in number, a complaint arose on the part of the Hellenistic Jews against the native Hebrews because their widows were being overlooked in the daily serving of food. Here we have a New Testament example of a church that has widows, and this church is caring for those widows who are in need. How did they do it? The apostles said to the congregation, to the whole church, select from among yourselves 7 men whom we will appoint over this business. And these 7 men, who are members of the Jerusalem church, they will take care of these widows. But these are Christian widows. These are not non-Christian widows. All right, let me give you a few more passages. Acts chapter 11. This is that famine that takes place in Judea that was prophesied by Agamous. And the church in Antioch of Syria, I hope this is a good reminder to you if you're in my Sunday morning Bible class. We just studied this a couple of weeks ago. Verse 29 says, in the proportion that any of the disciples had means, each of them, so this is a church in Antioch, the disciples in Antioch, each of them determined to send a contribution for the relief of the brethren living in Judea. Who is the church at Antioch helping? Christians in Judea. All right? Go to Romans chapter 15. Romans 15. We got 3 more passages. And each one of these 3 passages, they're all talking about the same event. Okay? Look at Romans 15, look at verse 25. But before I read it, let me provide this context. Paul is on his 3rd missionary journey. He's traveling primarily among Gentile people. And among the Gentile churches in Macedonia and Achaia, there's a handful of churches in those regions, they are giving money to Paul. Because in Jerusalem, there is a great need. There are Christians who are impoverished and they are struggling. And so these Gentile churches in Macedonia and Achaia are giving money to Paul to carry back to Jerusalem, okay? Now, Romans 15, look with me at verse 25. Romans 15, verse 25. But now I am going to Jerusalem serving the saints. For Macedonia and Achaia have been pleased to make a contribution for the poor among the saints in Jerusalem. Paul says, I'm going to Jerusalem. I've got all this money in my pocket that these Gentile churches have given me, but it's going to saints in Jerusalem who are in need. All right, go to 1 Corinthians chapter 16. Bill referenced this passage before we took up our collection this morning. 1 Corinthians 16 and verse 1. Now concerning the collection for the saints. It's the same collection that we just read about in Romans 15. Paul writes to the Corinthians and he says, you take up this collection, lay by and store on the first day of the week. Now go to 2 Corinthians, go to chapter 9. Apparently the Corinthians were a little bit slow in getting this contribution together. Because by the time Paul writes 2 Corinthians, he dedicates 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9 to further encouragement to them. Hey, get this money together. I'm coming. I'm going to be there soon. Get this money together and don't embarrass me and don't embarrass yourselves when I get there. Now look at 2 Corinthians 9 and verse 1. It is superfluous for me to write to you about this ministry to the saints. What you have on the screen and what we just looked at together in our New Testaments is every New Testament passage about church benevolence. I may have missed one, but I don't know of any others. If I did, I didn't intentionally leave it out. Every passage we see about church benevolence in the New Testament, we see local churches supporting Christians. Local churches supported their own needy, Acts chapters 2, 4, and 6. But when a local church was unable to support its own needy, other local churches sent funds to that church so that it could help its own people. In Acts 11, there's a famine in Judea. The churches in Judea don't have the funds. They've exhausted their funds. Now what happens? Antioch says, we'll send you money. We'll help you out. So Antioch sends money to Judea. They take it to the elders of the various congregations, and then those elders take that money and they help their own needy people. In Romans 15 and the 2 Corinthian passages, we see multiple churches from Macedonia and Achaia sending money to Jerusalem because Jerusalem has already exhausted its own funds trying to help its people, and they still had greater needs. And multiple churches said, we will send you money in Jerusalem to help your own people. This became the issue. Once this started being discussed, virtually every debate was no longer about the institutional board and that first arrangement, that first issue. After that, every debate was about limited benevolence and should churches be helping all men or just Christians. Now somebody says, wait a minute. Who's going to care for needy and impoverished people in this world if the churches from their treasuries aren't going to do it? Who's going to care for all the needy people of this world? Here's the answer. I will. You will. Galatians 6 and verse 10 says, therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all men, but especially those of the household of faith. As I individually have an opportunity to help someone in need, I better help that person in need. And if I don't, I'm going to stand accountable to God for that. I'm going to help people. You're going to help people. And there are numerous ways that we can do that. Individually, as we have opportunity, we need to be helping people. But when we look in the New Testament, we see when local churches acted collectively, they helped other Christians. Now, that pretty well dealt with the issue of the orphans' homes, but what about the colleges? And we're just going to spend a few minutes on this as we bring our lesson to a close. While the orphanages were the source of a lot of debate, the colleges became another institution that created a lot of controversy. Christian colleges like Lipscomb and Abilene and Pepperdine, etc., we talked about some of those last week. How were these colleges arranged? Take a guess. An institutional board said to local churches, send us your money and we will oversee that young boys and young girls are taught and trained. An institutional board collected funds and provided oversight for the work of churches of Christ. It was the exact same arrangement as the diagram I showed you earlier about the orphans' homes. That's why I throw in the colleges in this same sermon, because it was the exact same arrangement. I want to put a picture of a man on a screen here that you may or may not have heard of. This is a man by the name of Batsell Barrett Baxter. From 1956 to about 1980, I believe he was the head of the Bible department at Lipscomb. Good man, very pleasant man from everything I've read about him. He was a strong advocate for the institutional arrangements. And in 1964, he published a little pamphlet that was called Questions and Issues of the Day. And in that pamphlet, he was talking about whether or not churches ought to be financially supporting colleges from their treasuries. And here's what he said. Some who are agreed that the church can contribute to an orphan's home are not convinced that the church can contribute to a Christian school. It is difficult to see a significant difference so far as principle is concerned. The orphan's home and the Christian school must stand or fall together. Why does he say it is difficult to see a significant difference so far as principle is concerned? Because the arrangement was identical. You've got local churches sending money to an institutional board. In this case, it's a college board of trustees saying, send us your money and we will oversee the work. And these colleges got to have great importance among the brotherhood. But Baxter was exactly right that the orphan's home and the college, because they are designed the same way, you can't say, well, I support one but not the other. But these colleges came to be seen as indispensable to the church. Where are the preachers going to come from if we don't have colleges to train them? We need the schools to teach young people the Bible, and if we don't support these colleges, then they're going to turn to businesses. And if they turn to secular businesses for funding, well, then they're going to become secular schools. So we have a responsibility to fund these colleges. It's funny, when I read about preachers in the New Testament, I don't read about them going to preacher colleges. It's amazing that these colleges and these schools, which at the time in the 1960s were seen as indispensable to the church in the 20th century, it's amazing that they're nowhere to be found in Scripture. They weren't indispensable in the first century. So why are they indispensable in the 20th century? Well, do you have a better grasp of the issue now? I'm going to ask you the question that I told you at the beginning I was going to ask you. What was the issue about originally? Should an institutional board with its directors provide oversight for the work of churches of Christ? Some said yes, some said no. And that was true for the orphan's home. It was true for colleges and schools. Can a church do its work without the aid of a separate organization? I think the New Testament answer to that is yes. We don't need to create some other institution to stand between us as a congregation and the work that we need to do. So in the next lesson, 2 weeks from now, we'll be out of town next Sunday. 2 weeks from now, we're going to talk about the sponsoring church arrangement. And if you don't know what that is, you just have to come back in 2 weeks and you'll find out. But I'll tell you this, it's going to be very similar to what we talked about this morning in the way that it's arranged. Well, we encourage you to be back with us tonight at 6 o'clock if you can. If you're here this morning and you're not a Christian, the greatest thing we could encourage you to do is to not leave this building before you give your life to Christ and begin serving Him. And I know the lesson has not really been one to encourage you to do that. But if you know your life isn't right with the Lord, we want to talk to you about that. We want to help you. Are you washed in the blood that Jesus shed for you? If we can help you this morning, we invite you to come to the front as we stand and sing together.